Often, people will feel like no matter what they do, they just can't seem to build muscle. And in this video, I'm going to cover some hard truths on why this might be the case. Now, we're going to talk about those last because often there's other reasons for why someone's not building muscle, and those are far more common than the last thing that we're going to talk about. But that is a hard truth that we'll need to discuss. Now, I know how you feel. I've been in this situation. I've trained consistently for years without really making much progress. And then I finally discovered kind of what was blocking me. And that will be kind of the second main fundamental that I'll talk about here. But if you're in this position in which you're struggling to gain muscle, I think that this video is definitely going to help you out. And there might just be something in this video that will unlock the gains for you, in which you'll actually start seeing the results that you thought that you would be making once you got into this whole bodybuilding thing. So I want to first start with a few of the fundamentals of building muscle and some things that you need to have in place to make sure that you are indeed putting yourself in a position to grow muscle. And often, if someone's not growing muscle, it's because they don't have one of these fundamentals in place. So first, I want to talk about having an appropriate training stimulus. So the core of building muscle is lifting weights and making sure that you do indeed have an appropriate training stimulus. So first off, you need to have an appropriate training volume. You need to be training your muscles with enough sets per week, but not too many sets per week in which you can't recover from that training volume. And check out my video on how much to train to get a better understanding of how much you should indeed be training when it comes to your volume. Also, your training frequency is important to some degree. Training muscle at least twice per week is probably a good idea to maximize hypertrophy. You could argue that even up to 3-4 times could potentially have an edge for hypertrophy, but I would say at least twice per week, and you're putting yourself in a really good spot. Also, your intensity, or how close you're training to failure, definitely matters. All of your sets that you count towards your volume should be within about 4 reps from failure. And I think it is best to, on average, leave about 2 reps in the tank, because I think that this still gives you a very good stimulus per set that you're doing in the gym, but you don't get nearly as much fatigue as when you train to all-out failure. And then for your rep range, I would recommend working in the 8 to 15 rep range on average, as this allows you to accumulate quite a bit of training volume, but it's not going to be so fatiguing as working in the 4 to 8 rep range all the time. Additionally, your exercise execution matters a ton. Training with a full range of motion, using a controlled cadence, actually feeling the target muscle that you're training, actually getting a good pump in the muscle you're training. That is very important as well. And then alongside this, you need to be consistent with your training program. If you're not building muscle, but your training program has you training 4 days per week, but you're only in the gym once per week, that's where you start. Start being consistent with your training program. And if any of these variables are off by a significant amount, it could lead to you just seeing less progress than you could. I know that when I first started out, my exercise execution was not good. I was focused on just lifting more weights in the gym rather than executing lift with a good quality range of motion and targeting my target muscle group. I remember doing barbell rows, and they weren't really barbell rows. It was just more like heaving the weight back and forth. I wasn't stimulating my back. I was just trying to lift more weight. And when I started focusing on exercise execution, I started building much more muscle. So all of these principles of an appropriate training stimulus can be the reason that you're not building muscle, and you must be consistent with this training stimulus or your training program. Now, the second reason you might not be growing muscle is you're just not eating enough total calories. When it comes to nutrition and it comes to building muscle, the number one thing to have in place is your total amount of calories you're eating. And this was my main blocker. For 3 years, I was consistent in the gym. My training program was, it wasn't the best, but it wasn't terrible, right? It had some good fundamentals in place. I was doing compound lifts, and I was doing quite a bit of stuff right. But my main blocker was I was just constantly putting myself in a calorie deficit and not eating enough food to actually give myself a anabolic environment to build muscle. And when I say enough total calories, what do I mean by that? Well, that doesn't even necessarily mean that you need to go through some bulking phase and gain a bunch of weight and, gain 5 pounds in a single month. If you're struggling to build muscle and you're still kind of just starting out, just eating maintenance calories, enough food to not be losing weight, you're very likely going to build muscle. And I wasn't even doing that. And that's what was really holding me back. So I think that, if you're just starting out, you don't necessarily need to focus on hitting a certain calorie surplus and stuff like that. Just eat enough food to not lose weight and you will build muscle. Now, at some point, it's probably going to be a good idea after your first several months of training to actually eat in a calorie surplus, eating more calories than you expend each day, to actually see your weight go up over time, as that's going to provide your body with the raw materials it needs to build and grow muscle. It's going to put yourself in a hormonal environment that's going to be more anabolic. And one way to think about it is like, if you don't gain any weight, where do you expect that muscle to come from? Now, you can use the energy from fat tissue to some degree, but that body recompositioning is only going to last so long. So I think after several months, I would shoot to gain about 1% of your body weight per month. And that will ensure that you're in a appropriate calorie surplus. So the first two, make sure you have an appropriate training stimulus and make sure you're eating enough total food. Now, number 3 is making sure that you're eating enough protein. So having roughly about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight is a very reasonable kind of rule of thumb. Could you be a little bit lower than that? Absolutely. You could probably be just fine eating, 0.7, 0.8 grams per pound. But 1 gram per pound is just simply a nice rule of thumb that's easy to remember. Now, when it comes to your protein frequency across the day, or how often you eat protein across the day, it's probably good to separate your protein feedings out across about 3+ meals throughout your day, as we don't necessarily have a way to just like store that protein in our body and use it for later. So in general, we have to consume protein to use that protein and use those amino acids to eventually build muscle. So across your day, I would recommend 3+ meals of protein spread fairly evenly across the day and having about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. But as I mentioned earlier, the number one thing when it comes to your nutrition is going to be your total calories. And I would say that's going to be much more of a blocker for you compared to your protein intake. Now, another reason that could be holding you back from making progress is just having a very stressful lifestyle and also not sleeping enough. So if your sleep and your stress management isn't in order, that can prevent you from building muscle. Now, this one can definitely be tricky, and we don't always have control over the stresses that come in our life, whether it's work and different things like that. But I would say if you really focus in on improving your sleep, getting your sleep hygiene in place, sleeping in a cool, dark environment, limiting light exposure towards the nighttime, getting some light exposure earlier on in the day, avoiding caffeine too late in the day, and really optimizing your sleep and trying to get, 7+ hours on average per night, I definitely think that that's going to put everything in the right direction for you to start building some muscle. So these 4 kind of fundamentals here of having an appropriate training stimulus, eating enough total calories, eating enough protein, sleeping enough, managing stress, all of these play a significant role in building muscle. And if you don't have these in place, this is where I think your focus should be, getting these fundamentals in place. And I definitely think that these fundamentals can unlock the muscle growth processes for you. Now, let's talk about a couple of hard truths here. So one is that building muscle takes time. Sometimes it feels like watching paint dry, and you might actually be building muscle, but it might just be taking a long amount of time. Like in your first year of training, let's say that you can build 15 pounds of muscle. I don't think that that is terribly far off for most people on average. A rule of thumb is you can probably cut that in half every year, to where your second year, maybe you can build about 7 or 8 pounds. Your third year, maybe about 5 pounds. Your fourth year, maybe 3 or 4 pounds. And it just kind of keeps working its way down from there. So if you're outside of your first several months of training, those gains are just going to come slowly. So if you don't notice muscle gains in the matter of a couple months, well, that's probably pretty normal at this point. And you might not notice significant progress until you look back on photos a year in the past. Then you might notice some changes. But if it's just been a few months, you might just have to accept that, hey, building muscle takes some time here. Now, another kind of hard truth is the genetic component to this whole building muscle thing. I would say personally, I probably actually have fairly decent genetics for building muscle. I wouldn't say I necessarily have the best genetics. Like, I'm not, Steve Hall over here, but I also don't think I have poor genetics, as all throughout high school, I was athletic. I had no problem ever really building strength and stuff like that. And I would say my muscle growth genetics are fairly decent. But there's going to be people that are outliers on both spectrums. I literally had guys at my college that they would literally just play basketball every day, and they were more jacked than I could even imagine, right? They wouldn't even lift weights because they thought that like their arms would get too big. And like, they weren't the guys that were just saying that to like sound cool. They were legit. Like, their arms would get bigger from playing basketball. So you're going to have those guys, but you're going to have people on the opposite end of the spectrum in which they can train in the gym consistently, have these 4 fundamental principles in place. They're patient with it. They give it time, but for whatever reason, maybe instead of gaining 15 to 20 pounds in the first year, their potential is more like 5 or 10 pounds. Now, I don't want this to come out as, the answer here is that you have poor genetics. Like, I think the far majority of the time, someone thinks they have poor genetics, but they just haven't given it enough time, or they don't have one of these fundamental principles in place. Like, when I was starting out and I was in those years of like just figuring this thing out and I couldn't figure it out, I was like, maybe I just have bad genetics for this. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this lifting thing. But then when I look back on it, it's like, hey, I wasn't eating enough total food. I was trying to do like powerlifting and bodybuilding at the same time, and like just not really getting anywhere with that. My training program was not optimized. I wasn't focused on exercise execution. My volume was probably way too low because it was a little powerlifting focused. No wonder why I wasn't building muscle at a very optimal rate. But then when I got those in order and I gave it, 2 or 3 years, I look like a completely different person. Like, you could go back on this channel and look at some of the videos of myself. Like, I don't know, I probably have videos of 3 or 4 years ago. I feel like I look like a little kid compared to now. Now, of course, like, I'm 25 now instead of 21. So there is just like some maturity that comes with that. I guess I'm still not that mature if you're asking me. But with that, I've definitely made some progress over the last few years. And now when I look back on it, it's like, hey, I definitely didn't have bad genetics. It was a matter of just not having these fundamentals in place. So I don't want this to come across as this is likely the answer for you, but there is a hard truth with genetics that, hey, some people just don't have as much of a propensity to gain muscle. And that's okay. People with poor genetics, if you can gain, say someone with good genetics can gain 40 pounds of muscle over their lifting career. Well, say you're an outlier, say you can only gain 15 or 20. Well, I still think that you can get to a really good place and still, like, gaining 20 pounds of muscle, you're going to have more muscle than the average dude out there, and you're probably going to look really good. All right. So I think that in most cases, the reason you can't build muscle is because of one of those first 4 fundamentals. You don't have an appropriate training stimulus. You're not eating enough calories. You're not eating enough protein. Your sleep is dog crap and you're just stressed out all the time. Almost always, it's one of those 4 things, but it could also be that you're not being patient enough with it, or your genetics might be on the more poor side when it comes to building muscle. All of these could be reasons you're not building muscle. I would focus on those 4 fundamentals. I would give it time. I would focus on the things you can control. And I definitely think that you're going to find yourself in a place where you are indeed building muscle. All right. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in that next one.